So good afternoon, Professor Weitzman. It is a pleasure and an honor to have you here at the European University Institute today. And really, I read with pleasure also your book with Gernot Wagner. So thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to do this interview. So first of all, I would like to ask you, science tells us today that the longer we wait to cope and to act seriously in reducing concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the higher the probability of an extreme event will occur. So my question here is, do we really need a few more catastrophic events for taking serious action against climate change?
Well, I think that it really has to be felt on a grassroots level. That something catastrophic is associated, it's possibly associated with climate change. It should be felt on the level of the common population that something dangerous is happening. So I'm afraid to really get countries to agree to give up some of their sovereignty, there needs to be pressure from the ground up. And unfortunately, I fear that pressure from the ground up will only really come when there is something disastrous or catastrophic that is linked to climate change. Otherwise, the governments are not under a real pressure to put into place an international structure.
Okay, thank you. And a bit linked to this, in Climate Shock, your recent book, you defined climate change as uniquely global, uniquely long-term, irreversible, and uncertainty. And you interestingly call this the Big Four. So can this pressure you mentioned tackle a change for which we see these Big Four as an opportunity rather than a threat?
Well, dealing with a threat is an opportunity, I think. It's just a question of whether you're looking at it from one side or from another. It's an opportunity to get ourselves seriously off of such a carbon-dependent economy, but the opportunity is driven by the threat that something really bad might happen if we keep on the present course.
Okay, and hopefully this opportunity will be taken at the recent meeting that our readers will have in Paris. So leaders from all around the world will convene in Paris at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, also known as the COP21. And the declared objective of the COP21 is to achieve a new international agreement on climate applicable to all countries, with the aim of keeping global warming below this 2-degree Celsius target. So what could be, in your opinion, a practical solution on what to do next to climate change?
Well, this opportunity of this 21st session is presenting the possibility, at least, of talking about climate change, of talking about carbon dioxide concentrations, of naming some hypothetical targets. What it lacks is an overall framework that different nations are subjecting themselves to, so that it would assign, so the international framework could assign targets to various countries, could enforce that these targets are being fulfilled and so forth. It's still voluntary. It's some countries, especially the EU maybe, are going beyond what is individually in their small best interest, but they're not going very far beyond what's in their interest because there is no overall framework covering this kind of what we call an externality or a public goods in economics.
Thank you, very interesting. We see like carbon price as one of the very powerful tools to tackle climate change, but how this can be acceptable to our leaders and population, and also what's the scale of a sustainable and an acceptable carbon price?
Well, um, an optimistic view might be that we're moving towards something like that. Um, there are countries that have tried directly taxing carbon, or sections of countries. British Columbia, a province of Canada, has put in place a tax on carbon dioxide emissions that is universal, is applied to everything within their domain there. And at first there was some resistance to doing this, especially resistance from business. But once this got implemented, this carbon tax, they came to depend upon it as a source of revenue. And not so long ago, there were attempts to repeal the tax on carbon, but that was not popular because then you would have to raise taxes on something else. So somehow it has to be conveyed to the population that if you are internally taxing carbon, taxing emissions of carbon dioxide, you're gaining revenues which could directly be handed out to people. That was done in the case of British Columbia. Or you can lower other taxes. This is a point that I think is not fully understood by the public. They think of a tax as something that's taken away from them and dumped in the Atlantic Ocean or something like that. In reality, we need to shift the tax system so that these carbon dioxide producing activities are taxed, but there is tax relief on other activities, on labor earnings or capital earnings or something like that.
Yeah. Thank you. And drawing a bit on this example from Canada, you say, if we look at the US, last April, the White House and President Obama unveiled a major climate change plan, which they called the Clean Power Plan. And just a couple of days ago, there was this meeting with some major US company to discuss the follow-up of this plan. So what is your view on this very ambitious plan by the White House?
I think it's good. It's a step in the right direction. It's recognizing that there is a genuine problem or threat of climate change and we need some stronger action. It's still something that is incomplete. The U.S. is volunteering to put standards in place for certain activities, but there's no overall plan to tax carbon at the same rate among different countries. And most economists, myself included, consider this a very clumsy tool, this idea that you would have standards of carbon dioxide emitted per unit of energy or per capita. It's not comprehensive. It's not comprehensively covering every source of carbon dioxide. So it's a step in the right direction. It shows seriousness of purpose. It's better than not having such a step, but it's within the international realm. It's still a voluntary action by the U.S. and it's incomplete. It's not, and government has a big hand in all these restrictions. If you put a tax on, there's a lighter hand of government. Then each person or corporation chooses its own carbon dioxide emission level based on the fact that they will be taxed, that they'll have to pay something for it. This is not doing that. This is telling each industry or several, or to be more accurate, it's telling electricity producers how to produce electricity. I think it's better to have something like an overall price or tax on carbon and let them figure out what is the cheapest way to attain these targets.
Thank you. And speaking about us, our daily lives, I'm just one citizen, and but we're about 7 billion people in this world. And when we talk about tackling climate change, then the paradigm, every little helps, kind of fell apart. So how do you deal with this paradox in your daily life and your carbon footprint?
Well, an economist, I'm trained as economist. We have other examples of these kinds of phenomena. They're called public goods phenomena. The idea is that that the society, the government within a country, the government takes care of these externalities or public goods. It determines the budget level of defense, the budget level of firefighting, the budget level of education and schools. So we're used to that being the role of government within a country, but we're still used to having each country be sovereign. We don't have in mind yet a body that would be devoted to this problem and would say vote on the common price level. I think we need to be aware that we must go eventually towards an overall solution. I try my best to explain this in lectures and in things that I write. I think we're making some progress on that, but it's a long haul, and as I said before in the answer to an earlier question, I'm afraid I think that it really does need a kind of a shock that to really push down this idea that each country is sovereign. In this area, they have to have something like a common assembly where they do something like vote on what is the common price level, or what are the overall output levels of carbon dioxide. We're still a long way from that because we're not used to the sovereignty of a country being challenged in many spheres. So I keep hoping, I keep pushing this idea. That British Columbia example is really well worthwhile because when they first put in a tax on carbon, they did it wisely. They rebated the revenues that they collected on carbon taxes to each citizen. So each citizen got a check in the mail, and they got it before even the tax was put on. And as I said, there was resistance to this, but once the population got used to the idea that carbon dioxide producing activities have to be paid for, it was difficult to get off of this system. It was difficult to revoke it. So I hope that there's enough individual movement within countries toward this kind of a regime, and that eventually the countries will say that, look, this is significant enough, and the citizens will say this is a significant threat to our welfare, that they will push to have some international overall accord.
So, Professor Weitzman, thank you very much for giving us the pleasure and honor to listen your view on this important aspect. And it was as I say, was very interesting reading your book recently, but even more now to have this great opportunity. So,
Well,
thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.